Once upon a time, in a small, isolated village, people were wary and kept to themselves. Food was scarce, and they guarded their provisions tightly. Then one cold evening, 3 weary travelers arrived at the edge of the village, carrying nothing but their walking sticks and a large empty pot. The travelers knocked on the door of the first cottage and asked, "Could you spare a bit of food? We've traveled far and are very hungry." The old woman who answered frowned and replied, "We only barely have enough food for ourselves. Be on your way." The travelers sighed and moved on to the next house, but each villager gave the same response, closing their doors with a shake of the head and a muttered apology. Finally, one of the travelers turned to the others and said, "These people seem too afraid to share their food, but I have a good idea." In the village square, the travelers set down their pot, filled it with water from the well, and built a small fire underneath. Curious, a few villagers peeked out from their windows, wondering what these strangers were up to. Soon, one by one, they wandered out into the square. A young boy approached first, watching the travelers as they placed a large round stone into the water. He furrowed his brow. "What are you doing?" he asked. One of the travelers smiled warmly. "We're making stone soup," he said, stirring the pot with a long spoon. "It is an ancient recipe, a delicious soup made from a single stone, but it would be so much better with just a pinch of salt and pepper." Hearing this, the boy ran home and returned with a small shaker of salt and a few peppercorns. The travelers sprinkled them into the pot with a flourish, stirring slowly. Before long, an elderly man approached and asked, "What's going on here?" "We're making stone soup," replied the traveler. "It's almost perfect, but it would be a bit better with a few carrots." The old man, curious and now intrigued, hurried back to his cottage. Soon he returned with 2 carrots, which the travelers happily chopped and added to the pot. The fragrance of the soup began to waft through the square. More villagers gathered, their mouths watering and their eyes widening in curiosity. "It smells delicious," exclaimed a woman. "But it could use some potatoes," one of the travelers hinted, as if to herself. The woman nodded and returned with a handful of potatoes. The travelers diced them up and tossed them into the pot, where they began to soften and enrich the broth. One by one, the villagers contributed to the soup. A butcher brought a few scraps of meat, saying, "This will give it some hearty flavor." Another woman brought onions, a young girl added a handful of green beans, and an old man brought out a bundle of fresh herbs he'd been drying by his hearth. As each person contributed something, the soup grew richer, thicker, and more fragrant. The villagers laughed and talked among themselves, delighted to be sharing in the creation of something special together. For the first time in a long while, they felt a sense of community and warmth. Finally, the soup was ready. The travelers ladled it into bowls, handing them to the villagers who had gathered around the fire. Each villager took a taste and sighed in delight. "It's the best soup I've ever had!" exclaimed a young woman. The travelers smiled knowingly. "It's amazing what a little stone can do with the right ingredients." That night, the entire village gathered around the fire, enjoying the warm soup and sharing stories. The villagers, who had once been suspicious and guarded, laughed and shared freely with one another. And the travelers, who had started with nothing but a stone, had brought them together in a way they would never forget. As dawn broke, the travelers packed up their pot, leaving the village as quickly as they had come. But from that day on, whenever the villagers gathered to make soup, they would add a stone to the pot as a reminder of the lesson they had learned, that by coming together and sharing what little they had, they could create something truly wonderful. And so, the village was never the same again.